Back again to the second episode of the Useful AI Hour podcast. I'm your host, Ashwin Ramasamy, co-founder of Moative, and I have Nitin, co-founder of Pando. Nitin, great to have you.
Yeah, Ashwin, thank you. It's a treat to be here.
You run a technology company that focuses on asset-heavy industry, which is transportation. Talk a little bit about Pando, what you do, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. I run Pando. We are a AI for logistics business. We essentially help manufacturers, distributors, and retailers, primarily in the US, both mid-market and very large enterprise, help figure out their procure to pay for logistics or freight.
So the promise of data-driven decision making, the promise of catching exceptions earlier, the promise of figuring out supply chain shocks based on triggers that is happening in the market, all of that has been around for a while. And you started introducing yourself saying you're an AI company for logistics. When you go and say this, what are the expectations from someone who is suffering from a port strike, for example?
In most manufacturing companies, distribution companies, retail businesses, logistics as a function did not exist till very recently. Right? The problem existed, the processes existed, the jobs to be done existed. But organizationally, a team that was dedicated just to supply chain and logistics did not exist till for much earlier than maybe the last decade or so, right? Usually procurement teams or manufacturing teams that had a couple of people on their team that also did transportation and logistics, right? Largely seen as a commodity industry. Freight was procured and oftentimes seen as a headache that had to be managed. The famous "where is my truck" or "where is my product" was sort of a necessary sort of evil that you had to just get through in sort of fulfilling your brand's promise, right? For most traditional industries, manufacturers, distributors, and retailers, there are aspects of these problems, especially problems like supply chain, that are that have been solved for a point in time, 10, 15, 20 years back. And the world has fundamentally shifted. And this is not from a technology perspective alone, the world shifting, but the way their customers are consuming has shifted. Their customers' expectations have shifted, right? And the technology has not kept up with what those shifts have been. And so I think fundamentally just saying, look, the modes of freight or delivery have changed. You didn't have electric vehicles that could deliver things earlier. Now, customers talking about drone delivery, etc. as well. You didn't have those modes earlier. Where you sourced from, where you delivered has changed. The expectation that I can try before I buy or I can return if I don't like is now a new expectation that didn't exist 15 years back. That has brought about a whole bunch of complexity around this thing. Samples in the B2B world, sending samples, and then if you like it, then return the samples, I'll send you the final product, etc. There's all sorts of these like consumption and production and distribution patterns that have fundamentally shifted, right? And I think most customers don't start the conversation by saying, well, at least a majority of customers don't start the conversation by saying, I've got innovation dollars for AI, tell me where I can use it. Or, that's not how conversations starts with, hey, I have a distribution issue, or I have a, planning issue, or I have a sourcing issue. And how do I sort of solve this problem in a way where I don't have to increase my headcount, where I don't have to keep hiring to do this, where I, either can't afford or don't have access to, top tier talent to do this. And even if I do, then managing that team and, the overheads that come with it in a high interest rate environment is a hard thing to do. So how do I do that more effectively? I want to procure freight. The freight market is fluctuating wildly. I want to procure freight every quarter, but I'm today procuring freight once in 3 years because I don't have a team that's just dedicated to doing that. How can I bring expertise into my team when I don't have access to that expertise, etc. Right? So these are pretty fundamental problems. And the things that I just said, I think, about expertise or talent or any of these things could be applied to, other aspects of that business, not just supply chain as well, right? So customers ask questions like that, and the answer happens to be modern technology, which today is AI. is the way.
So transportation management, freight planning and those kinds of things, when you talk about, there have been large technology companies like in the supply chain space, like from Manhattans and the I2s and the Blue Yonders, and like all of those players are there. And all of them touch upon these problems, saying like, supply chain itself has changed, like complexity of supply chain has increased by order of magnitude, like in the last decade and so on. What kind of conversations are possible today with this platform shift, which is AI, that is simply not possible? Simply was not possible 3 years back, 5 years back.
Yeah.
I remember predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics being talked about like 5 years back, right? Every like transportation software company would talk about analytics for sure. But what has changed now, and what are the structural issues that can be solved now? At least there's a possibility of solving that was not possible before.
Yeah. So these companies, right, Manhattan, and when you said Manhattan and SAP and Oracle and Blue Yonder or whatever, you gestured towards it being back in the day, so to speak, right? But the reality is that these companies are going strong today, right, or till today, right? Because while these companies have been around for a while, the reality of the equation is that there hasn't been a fundamental technology shift in the last 20 years that has been fundamental enough to shift the landscape for these companies and specifically these products. So our view is actually that transport management systems, warehouse management systems, the traditional logistics execution systems are dead and dying. We think AI agents, which are AI employees, are not the future, but the present. We think that you can not only do predictive, prescriptive analytics, etc., but actually be able to make decisions and execute decisions, hand off tasks the way you would, and this is a fairly common parlance in logistics, right? I mean, if I had access to a ops research graduate from Georgia Tech, who's an analyst on my team, I could hand off a bunch of these things. My CFO would shoot me. There is no way I'll get access to headcount. And so how do I solve that without that, right? So I think, the ability to have this experienced, smart executive that is at your disposal, that can, execute, make decisions, and collaborate both internally and externally, I think opens up the canvas for the kind of problems that you can solve. So specifically answering your question, and making that comparison with some of these SaaS tools, right?
Yeah.
So, what was SaaS's promise? SaaS was supposed to, one, reduce technology costs, right? Because going from on-premise, data centers to cloud, SaaS was supposed to improve productivity, which is reduce the amount of headcount spend that you have. And SaaS was supposed to also at the same time reduce the impact the underlying dollar value, which is if it was a customer facing problem, then improve revenue. If it was an SG&A problem, then reduce costs, reduce risk of either, right? If you look at logistics as a category, none of these three things have actually happened in reality, right? Your technology costs have gone up.
In fact, like none of this has happened in entire manufacturing. That's why there is a certain sense of fatigue when you say like, I'm coming up with a new technology to solve your problems.
Absolutely, right? And let's talk about that fatigue and why this time we feel like it's different with what companies are now offering and the technology that's now available. But technology costs have not gone down with SaaS. It's in fact increased. The number of tools you use has increased. The number of every feature you need is actually a new tool now, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not the horizontal. Nobody makes horizontal tools anymore, etc. So overall technology costs have increased. We did this exercise where we basically said you take freight procurement as a problem, so to speak, right? And you break down, let's assume you have no software, and you break down every step of like a time and motion study of every step of what a procurement team needs to do to go from having no contracts to having live contracts, right? Break all of that down. And then you look at actually, and now they're doing everything manually, right?
Mhm.
Now look at what, after using a set of different tools that, which is a mosaic of tools, is the reality with most companies. How many of these are actually digitized? How many of them are continuing to be manual? And how many new tasks have gotten added
Mhm.
because you're now using software, right? Uh, One, that list now looks longer. And two, the percentage number of manual tasks is actually increased, not reduced, right? So you're actually while the claim is that we're reducing, headcount and improving productivity, the reality is that you're actually, it's going in the other direction. And the same thing, is true for actual dollar value of impact as well, right? I think with agents, what you're actually able to drive from a technology perspective is, the ability to actually have an impact on all three of these metrics, right? Can I reduce my underlying spend? Can I do that without increasing my headcount? And in
Mhm.
fact, thinking about more productivity, and actually complement and have access to certain kinds of skill sets and talents that you today don't have access to. And three, can I also, while doing this, be able to drive that productivity in the underlying spend as well, right? So the trifecta of technology costs, headcount,
Productivity.
and the underlying productivity of the dollar, in terms of the underlying spend, I think is largely what we're able to impact itself, right? That's the promise.
Yeah. So, what is an agent?
Yeah,
So that's I mean, so when we say agentic, there is like a nod in the room, but like then people ask, like, hey, what does an agent do? Right?
yeah,
Like, what is your definition of an agent?
yeah. I think the framework that we use, and the framework that we find easiest to talk about with customers is, is an AI employee, rather than an agent, right? The way we think about an AI employee is, very much akin to hiring a smart, early career generalist, who understands your industry, who understands the function that you are hiring her for, has access to data sets and external resources outside your business that make them more aware of what's happening in terms of the macro and the micro of the function that they're driving. And just like how, if you were to hire an employee, you'll have to onboard them, just like how you will have to train them, just like how you will then give them certain tasks initially, but monitor the outcome of those tasks before having impact on a business. You would essentially operate. That is the same modality with which you would operate with an AI employee as well. So if you're a insurance business, and you run a call center, that analogy holds good. If you're a manufacturing business and you're procuring materials and freight and moving material, that analogy holds good, equally, essentially, right? So I think if we were to sort of consistently wear that lens in sort of seeing, hey, this is a generalist and early career, industry specific functional person that I'm hiring. I think everything else sort of begins to fall in place in the way we sort of think about that framework, right? So from a technology perspective, this AI employee is essentially what we call an agentic mesh, right? Which is basically, depending on the function, depending on what you want to get done, depending on the maturity of what you want to get done in terms of, are we looking for suggestions? Are we looking to take decisions? Are we looking to manage exceptions as well? And are we looking to actually execute those decisions, collaborating third parties? So in that spectrum, how much do you want the AI employee to do? Depending on that, it would essentially be a number of agents, and these AI agents are essentially built on, if you have used ChatGPT, if you have used Gemini, or any, if the audience has, they're essentially built on these large language models that are trained on billions of data sets that are trained on the internet, etc. Right? Now, what Pando essentially does is takes these large language models and focuses them on enterprise-specific knowledge graphs. Right?
Let me ask you this, right? When you say focus on a specific problem, are you calling logistics as a problem, or are you calling freight booking as a problem? How narrow does the agent go, or how broad does the agent go?
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about this in the context of inputs and outputs, so to speak, right? So let's say you were to hire an ops research grad from Georgia Tech, and as an analyst on your logistics team or your supply chain team, and you say, hey, I mean, the first problem that I want you to deal with is I think our freight contracts are not structured right, both in terms of cost, but also in terms of the right sort of carriers, the right transporters. We're only in certain lanes we have only FedEx, in other lanes we have only Kuehne+Nagel. There are certain high frequency lanes where we're not getting the right service. So can you just analyze this and create a plan for a freight procurement event that will allow us to both reduce the overall cost, but also make sure that our customer service and risk is managed in a way that is effective, right? It's a classic problem. Every company does it all the time, right? Um, the outcome that you want from it, or the action at the end of this, is that you run a bid event and you sign a bunch of contracts that you can start using from Monday morning. That's the outcome, right? So it's a pointed outcome. But to be able to get to that pointed outcome, you're going to have to do a bunch of analysis. And to do that analysis, you're going to have to look at a fairly broad set of different contexts. And the context, as somebody who's just joined this company, you're going to have to look at, sorry, where are my manufacturing locations? Where do I source from? Where are my distribution centers? And where are my customers, right? So your network. You're going to have to look at your network and say, okay, what are the lanes that are high frequency? So you're going to look at demand patterns and supply patterns and say, look, I mean, here is where there is high frequency sourcing. Here is where there's high frequency distribution. You might look at some patterns there. You would also go down the path of then saying, hey, who are my carriers? Who are my transporters? How have they performed in the past? There is some basic calculations like, hey, I mean, high frequency lanes, do I have enough carriers? Do they have enough capacity, etc., and so on. And then subsequently, you're going to look at data around, look, is there a forecast for my, am I going to shut down a particular DC, etc. as well, right? So, I'm oversimplifying this problem. These are, multivariate n factorial sort of complexities, but you're going to have to look at a lot of this to then decide, here is sort of the context that I now have, that I can then decide, plan and strategize as to, how do I now execute the bid, and then subsequently execute the bid, negotiate, and then finalize a particular contract. Right? This is what this transportation analyst would do. So
this is the process.
This is the process, right? What an AI agent will do, or what an AI employee will do, is not very different from this, right? Ultimately, what you want to get done is, I want to be able to sign a contract, right? And now, with Pando, what we've essentially done is we've been able to sort of block off, or slice and dice this problem both horizontally and vertically, in a way that it can be modularized, or it can be sort of put together in a bit more of a configurable sort of pattern for customers, right? So now let's take two customers. One is a manufacturer that manufactures in Detroit and is an auto, tier one auto supplier that supplies to the OEMs, and it's largely going to, and is worried largely about outbound, supply into the factories. Largely using road transportation only, so only one mode of freight. They have only 10 customers, but those 10 customers are high volume, high value customers. So they need to keep them very happy. The constraints they're dealing with are different. They care about extreme reliability. And they have, let's say, $500 million of freight. They don't need 100 carriers or 1,000 carriers. They need 5 carriers that do these 8 lanes from a single source to maybe 20 destinations, but do it consistently at high service levels every day. Right? Now, this is one type of problem. For the same company, you look at where they're sourcing their supply from. Most of their supply from the tier 2 suppliers are actually coming from Asia. from Taiwan and Vietnam, right? Now, if you're sourcing from Taiwan and Vietnam, that supplier is supplying to probably 300 customers like you, which are tier one suppliers, right? And so when you're sourcing supply from Taiwan and Vietnam, it's ocean freight and air freight, depending on how urgently you need the component. It is high frequency, but frankly, it's okay if, because you have buffer inventory waiting, it's okay if, it comes a bit later. You care about cost because, your OEM, who's your customer, is tightly managing his margin and so negotiates you down. And so you need to make sure that your wafer thin margins are maintained. So you care about logistics costs as well, etc. That's a slightly different problem.
Yeah.
In most cases, the type of employee you will hire to manage this situation is pretty similar. It's just that the context you give them will be slightly different, and the outcome you get will be slightly different, right? And so the same thing is true for Pando as well. So what we've essentially been able to do is, depending on the mode of freight and depending on whether you want to just create a bid event, whether you want to just analyze and tell me what kind of bid event I can create, or whether you want me to analyze, create a bid event, and actually run the bid event and get you a contract, right? We've been able to slice this into smaller chunks or smaller agents that then work together to be able to deliver that AI employee's experience for you, right? And so let's say, in one particular case, a customer says, look, I want to be able to analyze and create a bid event, but I will do the negotiations myself, right? So, I just want to hand off the preparatory work, which actually takes a lot of time and effort, in sort of getting done, to the AI employee. The negotiation agent is not used. On the other hand, if you want to go down the path of being able to run the bid event, negotiate, and get me the final rates, then the negotiation event is also recruited to be able to then sort of make sure that the AI employees, think of these as employees with skill sets, if you will, right? I mean, you leverage certain skill sets if you want to sort of drive this, is the way we're doing this. So, just one last caveat there. I think one thing that we've been pretty surprised about is the reception that this gets with the execution layer, with the users or the actual analysts, the managers in supply chain organizations, right? And mind you, these are traditional industries, and within traditional industries, supply chain is a traditional function as well, right? So it's a double whammy. You'd assume going in that, sure, all this AI jazz is for Silicon Valley, and me sitting in the Midwest, and for a bunch of my team sitting in, between Atlanta and Chicago and Detroit. I don't know how they're going to receive this. Are they going to find this threatening, etc.? The reality is that most, and I'm now talking to a growing manufacturer who's hopefully listening to this podcast. The reality is that supply chain leader has come to you and said, I need more headcount. Has come to your CFO and said, look, I manage $150 million of freight. I need more people to be able to do justice to this function. The reality is you've said, sorry, we have a 3-member team, and this is all we have budget for. Manage the situation, right? And that in turn has translated to you being able to hold your ground on what your margins are. The reality is that they can do more. It's just that there isn't enough bandwidth to do more. They don't have enough people to do more, right? And so, if they had more bandwidth and if they had more skills in their team, they're able to deliver far greater returns on that $100 million logistics spend than they are today. And so these guys are overworked and understaffed today, right? And so to superpower those teams with technology and skill sets like AI, I think gives them, they lap it up, they love it, right? Is at least what we've seen.
I understand the orchestration of a data science use case, building a data product and building a forecasting model and so on. What does orchestrating an agent mean? So when you in Pando say, like, I'm building this agent, what did you do? What was it like to build an agent?
Sure. For logistics, what we've actually seen is that there are like a half a dozen to a dozen tools that you're already using for logistics today. And each of those data silos, data sets are siloed.
Mm. Mm.
And most of these are API first products. And so these products then have APIs that Pando connects with, that then stream this data and normalize it in a way that is consumable by the LLM, essentially. So the enterprise data is part one. But what Pando also does is we have direct connectors with.
Sorry. So you still are deciding what rows of data, what columns of data to look at for a specific problem, and then tell the LLM to look at that. LLM does not decide like which. I mean, I have API access to these 5 systems. This is the problem statement. I'll now decide what normalized data looks like for this problem, and I'll work on it. That's not making that. It's not making that decision.
So today, what Pando does is the following, right? Which is all of our agents are built on a data platform layer, which essentially consumes all data from 10 broad sources or categories of tools, right? One is the ERP, the other is some kind of any kind of freight visibility solutions that you have. A third could be whatever, different sets of data. Not everybody has all of these tools. Some do, some don't, whatever, right? We don't go down the path of saying, look, I mean, give me these 10 data points from each of these individual buckets, right? We essentially say, look, I mean, whatever is the transactional data that is streaming from these applications, Pando will consume as is, right? What then happens is the data format structures could be different, etc. We then normalize it, and then subsequently for every agent, the decision on for a particular transaction, let's say I'm negotiating with a carrier, and the carrier then says, hey, I mean, this is what the whatever the particular uh, you know cost of a particular shipment is, or whatever else, right? To be able to say, no, I'm sorry, it can't be $100. 92 is where I'd like to draw the line. To be able to say that there is some amount of data and context that the LLM needs to be able to then respond with that, right? The decision on what data does it need to be able to form that point of view is taken by the LLM itself, right? Or by
Mm-hmm.
um, and the flip to that is that if that data set is not available in the normalized database that Pando makes available to the LLM, then it doesn't have that data to have that context. It only has general knowledge, so to speak, right? It doesn't have specific knowledge. So one way to sort of think about that is we also connect with third-party data sources, external data sources, which benchmark New York to Shanghai rates, for example, on a daily basis, and tell us, hey, I mean, for a container load that's going from New York to Shanghai, the cost today is, whatever, $3,000 down to $200, down to $400, whatever, right? Up and down. And so that spot market rate is something that we're sort of through an API call, we're consuming, and that's part of the common data set. Now, for instance, from Shanghai to Singapore, if let's say Pando doesn't have that data, or you've decided not to give us access to that data, or you've decided that we shouldn't be using that data, then when you're actually conducting that bid on that particular lane, it doesn't have that particular data set to be able to negotiate. Then it's just going to generally try to get to the best negotiation, look at tonality, and decide, okay, I mean, we've adopted a couple of negotiation strategies, and we've listed down 64 negotiation strategies, or different sections or types of negotiation that you can do for procurement of some kind, right? So we essentially adopted that into converted that into strategies for negotiation for an agent to be able to drive this, right? So it would say one of those things is collaborative negotiation, to say, hey, instead of me telling you this is the price that I want, can you tell me, and for this particular lane, New York to Shanghai, can you tell me what are your high frequency? Can the supplier tell the customer what are the high frequency 10 lanes that you operate in? I will match that against my network and tell you, what you can procure, you can give me, that will allow me to get the price that I want. So I'll do the analysis of my network plus your network to actually superimpose one on the other and tell you what. So it could do that, or it could say, look, I will guarantee a certain minimum volume, or it could say, hey, I will give you certain rebates if you deliver certain things on time, etc. Right? So it takes bunch of different strategies to be able to do it. That's the general knowledge. But
Right.
the benchmarking is the specific knowledge, right? Now, if you don't have access to that particular data set, you're not going to be able to sort of benchmark and tell them today the rates are actually this thing. The average of the last 100 days is actually $90, but you're saying it's $100. I won't be able to do it. It uses the general knowledge to be able to.
Right, right. So two questions come from that. Like, it's a good segue to the second question I earlier had, which is how do you take this to your customer,
Yeah.
right? I mean, especially since they've been burnt by the productivity of ERP that never came. And what kind of pushbacks do you get? Do you demo first or do you talk?
Yeah. So I think as early as we can put the product in the user and the customer's hands, the more they sort of feel comfortable with that reality. Because, you know, if you present an AI employee, it sounds threatening and creepy. If you experience an AI employee, it feels liberating and productive. And so I think, at least from our perspective, the go-to-market problem of both packaging, presenting, and driving value conversations out of AI products, I think has got to be product first, not marketing first. And so, the idea of product marketing takes a far more sort of high fidelity, implication.
Yeah.
In that context, right? So I think another and so our approach has been to say, look, uh, the world's best brands have already started on this journey. Here is where the world is headed, and let's have an exploratory conversation around how you can leverage this new technology to solve some of the problems that you need solved today, but you don't have either the capacity or the capability within your teams. And then there is the second bucket of customers that are saying, look, I have a problem and I want to solve it with AI, but I don't know if that looks like a hammer or a screwdriver or a spanner. Can you come explain to me what this looks like, right? Let's say I'm buying a CRM. I take demos from 20 CRMs. One UI might look slightly better. In one, I might have two features that are slightly different, whatever. But 99% of these products largely look the same.
Yeah.
Right? The experience is the exact same. So imagine the buying committees sort of, or the users sort of experience of evaluating software. You go through an RP and there are like 5 tools that you've demoed. Largely, that it's going to be a form, it's going to be a table, it's going to be a submit button, it's going to be a drag and drop of certain things in a Trello board of some kind. It is going to be notifications on the top right, there'll be chat in the bottom right. So they are now used to that template of what to see on a screen, and then suddenly you come in and with just a search bar, for example, right? And they're thrown off. They're like, sorry, what, where? Like, there is also this anxiety around, sorry, I can't see any data. If I want to see this particular shipment and where it is on a map right now, where do I see it? Or there's this anxiety of like, how much does the shipment cost? Like, where is the dollar value there? Why are you not displaying the dollar value there, etc., right? Because they're used to being there is this perception of control, but actually it is the bane of effort.
Right.
It is not the boon of control, it is the bane of effort. It's just that they are doing all of the heavy lifting, they're doing the processing, they're doing the decision making. And here you're going in and saying, yeah, of course, sure, you can dig in and get to that data, that's fine. But we're able to automate that, hand off a task, just say, hey, go do this and evaluate the outcome, right? And it's a fundamentally different sort of user experience in terms of what they're used to. So I think it's important for AI companies, just take them, while the problem we don't have to justify. I don't have to go tell them why logistics is a problem, why the world has changed, and why you need to solve that.
Right.
They're in the market buying software for that. They don't have to be sold on why they have to buy software to solve the problem also. They don't have headcount budget, so the only other way they can do it is through software. So the L1 of the problem is a problem, or the L2 of please buy software to do this, I don't have to sell them on. But it's a fundamentally differentiated technology stack in the back end and a user experience on the front end, which takes some education.
It's also a procurement Wild West, right? Like, so how do you sell this? Like, so are you selling employee or are you selling software?
Yeah. We're actually selling employee. We were selling software. We shifted to selling employee. And ultimately, these employees need tools through which they can execute, right? So, the stack on the enterprise side, on the business side, is there is a user and there is a software, so to speak, right? And in that user and the software, what we're selling is, I don't think it's necessarily a the choice is not always, and the budget is not always a user or a software. It should be eventually, but right now there is a headcount budget, and then there is a IT budget. The IT budget is 1% of revenue. The headcount budget is about 18 to 20% of revenue, depending on the industry and where in the world you are. But these are two separate line items, so to speak.
This is, I don't want this moment to pass very casually. 18% employee budget, labor budget versus like 1%, 2%, or even 5% IT budget. That's the opportunity, right? So you're not going to replace all the labor. Maybe like you will keep 30% of it. It's still like, 2% versus 6% kind of an opportunity. So, this is fascinating also because like I spent a ton of time like meeting various people in various industries. The initial response is like, hey, we are using an AI tool. It's a point solution they would use, which is sprinkling of like a chat UI and so on. But when you say like, you know what, like, you are doing a bunch of service for that software to work, clicking through buttons and things like that, and you don't need to spend time on it. It's not dawned on many people in many industries that like we are actually replacing a lot of labor, and we are not trying to replace your software, or we are not a better software. I was imagining that in manufacturing it would be a difficult conversation. So this is a completely different paradigm to go and sell. Are you selling this to the general managers of like a division, or are you selling this to like, who are you selling this to?
I don't know if it is a fundamentally new paradigm per se, right? In the sense, of course, the technology is, but from a sales process, right? I actually find it pretty, and early days, but I find it pretty telling that functions are understaffed. Look at the macro and then the micro of this as well, right? The reality is there is immigration issues everywhere in the world. There is labor issues everywhere in the world. There is, if you want to do logistics, supply chain specialized work today, one, there is just no talent available, and then two, that talent is expensive, and three, the interest rates are high. Four, you don't have budget to sort of then keep increasing headcount to do this. CFOs are saying revenue per employee is important, and your headcount is important. Keep that low. I don't want you to public markets are rewarding better profitability across the board. Like there are structural impediments to hiring one more person, essentially, right? And so the work doesn't disappear. The work is still the same. There is still an expanding body of manual work that needs to happen to be able to run a particular business. It's just that there are structural impediments to hiring more people, essentially, right? In supply chain, if you had 3 more people on your team, let's assume I'm a staffing agency, right? And if I could give you 3 experienced logistics guys, and you don't have to pay for them, right? But they're on your team, what would you do with them? What are the first 3 problems you'll throw them at? Invariably, the answer is procurement of freight, planning and daily dispatch planning, as well as strategic logistics planning, and reconciling freight invoices. These are the 3 most manual tasks that have direct dollar impact on my budget, right? And those 3 in those 3 business processes, specific tasks are largely what are causing this thing, right? So if you're able to identify that there is a structural impediment to hiring, there is a capacity versus bandwidth or utilization of capacity sort of problem, meaning there's more work, less capacity available, and you're able to identify exactly where that is the case, that is the business value, right? Because and I'll give you an example. There's a automotive manufacturer in Detroit that actually two examples. One is an automotive manufacturer in Detroit that is a fairly traditional company, like everybody else in Detroit, imports a lot of their components from Asia, distributes into North America. They're Ford's for one particular component, one of Ford's largest suppliers, supply to Tesla, to EV, to aerospace, etc. as well, right? It's maybe a $2 billion revenue company. They have about $150-200 million in logistics spend. There are three people that manage $200 million in logistics spend, and they sit in Detroit, and those three people are swamped, right? And so 5 years back, they decided they would go to their management and say, look, we need, and they put together a plan, etc. And they said, we need an 11-member team and here is how the ROI for that works out. All the ROI numbers, everything made sense. The CFO said, sorry, boss, nothing happening. Company is going to continue growing. I need more margin improvement, but this is the team that you get, right? They churned through two supply chain leaders, and they eventually hired one from Amazon. She ran North America transportation for Amazon, and she came in, introduced some technology, bettered. She said, you've given me 3 headcount. It'll be 3, but it won't be these 3. So she changed around the team. She got higher caliber, and she improved the margin numbers to a certain extent, right? But she also told the CFO, look, there is some of this work that needs to be done that I don't have people for, and I actually don't want to hire. I agree with you. We shouldn't be hiring more people. Let's outsource, and get a managed service provider with 5 people to sort of do this as well, right? They became a customer of Pando's about a year and a half back, where we went in and said, look, I mean, if you had 3 employees, where would you throw them? They said, these are the 3 places. We initially implemented, we were still selling software. Back then, we initially implemented software, gave them the tools to be able to execute a bunch of these things. And then, we said, look, what are you spending the most time on using this software? And they said, look, I mean, I spend about 2 hours a day updating a bunch of things, reviewing a bunch of things, taking decisions, and creating certain reports for management on a daily. So that's about 10 hours a week that you're spending on the software. There's about 20% of your time, right? And if I can, in a 10 hours a week, if I can automate 100% of that 20%, you don't have to spend time on Pando anymore. Is that valuable for you? That's initially how that conversation started. From then to saying, hey, it sounds like you're spending a lot of time on emails responding to questions from transporters on the delivery to a customer, or questions from transporters on delivery from a supplier. And those questions are largely asking for specific data points. What is the address? Sorry, can you reconfirm if this is the invoice number that I need to deliver? Stuff like that, right? So those are questions that we can auto respond to. Would that be valuable for you? Yes, that saves another hour and a half for me as well, right? So till this point, you're not saying you're replacing anybody, or sorry, your job is gone or whatever else, right? You're essentially saying, look, how can I better the quality of your time so that you can spend more time on other things? Last quarter, what we went in and said is, those 5 people that you've outsourced work to, you don't need those 5 people anymore, right? We'll bring that control back to you, but you don't have to hire more. We'll instead give you, we call it Pi by Pando, but Pi will be able to automate what those 5 people are doing for you on the outsourced managed service piece, essentially, right? Now, that has created a massive budget, which was earlier available. The CFO loves it because they were spending whatever $750,000 million on the outsourcing project. They're now saying, look, we'll only spend $500,000 on the software piece, and so new budget doesn't have to get created. But if we had just sold software, it would have been $100,000 deal. But because we're selling the experience, and because we're replacing a $750K sort of outsourced budget, we're now able to sell a $500,000 deal sort of going in, right? So I think there is. And all of this is only in our focus areas of freight procurement, planning, and payments. We're not doing anything outside this,
Right.
This parentheses of our focus area, right? So because we're able to sort of go down that path of, drawing on that headcount budget, I don't think it's a fundamentally new paradigm to how you'd sell. It's just that where you'd pull budget from changes. It is what is different is, I think, the 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 sellers with, I mean, well, sellers with a lot of muscle memory of how they sell SaaS or software struggle to have these conversations.
Exactly. I see a lot of founders going back and selling now
Yeah,
because the context shift is
is
difficult for like traditional like enterprise software
yeah,
sellers.
it is right, and that is different. So from the buying experience standpoint, for the customer, it is, the difference is in actually seeing the user experience, not the buying process.
Yeah,
But for the seller, it is the selling process that is shifted, right? Or the the standard, it's the same thing, right? I mean, from you generally go in and do a demo, then you do some discovery, then you do whatever, the way you sort of do that SaaS sales process, I think is going
yeah. The value selling in the enterprise truly was about this. So here's where I think the services guys like have an edge. Services sales guys, like they've always pitched a combination of productivity and labor and like technology and so on. So for them, this sales process is not very
Yes,
alien.
I agree with you. I think the enterprise SaaS sellers and the services sellers, it feels like it comes a bit more naturally, because you couldn't just sell a tool, you also had to sell the value of the tool, and oftentimes that meant implementation services or some kind of support services. And then you also had to talk about change management and transitions,
Exactly.
etc. Those were all muscles that continued to be used, that were used in the past, that will continue to be used in this paradigm as well.
Makes sense. I think we have come close to the top of the hour, or maybe more. So, just one last question before we close. What are you reading, or what are you listening to?
I'm reading this book by just on the last topic that we just spoke about, by David H. Meister, called Managing the Professional Service Firm.
Hmm.
Um, I think there's a lot of literature around just professional services, which as software companies, at least I did not understand to the depth, in making this statement that these are fundamentally different businesses. What does that actually mean? Are they actually fundamentally different businesses? Like, to what degree are they fundamentally different businesses, etc.? So anyway, David Meister is a Harvard professor, sort of is the authority on ProServe, and this is essentially like he goes into sort of what the business model is, and
Yeah.
how can you establish trust? What is consultative selling? Like, how do you, when you know when you're not a hammer, because we come from the world of being a hammer looking for a nail,
Mhm.
versus there you're a Swiss Army knife, trying to look for anything that comes on. So how do you sort of think about that and so on? So that's one. I'm also reading. Let's see what else is here. Hey, I'm actually, one thing that I found super effective, and I've started looking forward to fairly frequently, Eureka Labs. So
Okay.
Andre Karpathy's uh, uh, Substack uh,
Okay.
is excellent.
Oh,
Uh,
that's okay. I have never read it. Yeah.
he writes every week, longish form, and so it's a read, but it's excellent.
Yeah. So I'm reading this book, the Bell Lab, the book about genesis of Bell Labs.
Nice.
Um, how they manage to continue to churn innovation after innovation from a lab setup. And I'm going back 20 years and reading the same book I read 20 years back. It's a book called Beyond Reengineering by Charles Hammer. So my first job was a manufacturing company job. And like where they say every business is a growth business, you can still grow your business if the rest of the industry is growing at like only 2%. So how do you like extract value out of like the processes, reduce cost? How do you see so your job is not to send the invoice, your job is to make sure that the collections hit the bank. So how do you see everything as not as a collection of tasks, but like a process with an outcome and an input? If you think about it this way, how would you reorganize the organization? And suddenly I remembered this in the wake of AI. So we all have to become process engineers. Forget that like we are product managers. We need to become process engineers, learn the process, and then like see how to fix the process, where technology comes, where AI comes, where labor replacement comes, where labor comes, and all of that. So that's a
Okay,
good read to go
actually, I
back to.
just yeah, as you were talking about it, the other book that I'm also reading and I'm finding wildly fascinating uh, is a bit of an antithesis to what you just said, which
Mhm.
is that all of us have to stop becoming to move from being product managers to process engineers. Um, is this book called The Art of Game Design?
Okay.
It's by this guy called Jesse Shell. It essentially talks about how game designers. It's a textbook, uh,
Mhm.
but it's written very very well, and at least in the context of building AI agents, I'm finding game design very allegorical,
Okay.
right? And so it essentially goes through the process of, let's say, as a game designer, how would you think about designing a game, right? Start with the story, and then the players, and then the workflows, and then the journey, and then the inanimate objects that one has to interact with in the game. This is
Mhm.
in the context of a video game, basically,
Yeah. Yeah.
but can be applied to like any type of game design, essentially. But it
System
goes in
design. Yeah.
system design of any kind, or product design of any kind, or whatever, right? But essentially, it is, to me, it is user research on steroids,
Mm.
right? On crack, right? If you were to just wear a product manager's lens and read the book, you and apply everything that the author's talking about, from his perspective of designing a video game, in your perspective of designing an AI employee. um, for example, the chapters go, if you'll indulge me for a second, the chapters go, the first chapter is, first it's about the designer, then it
Mhm.
has a bunch of sections. The second chapter is the designer creates an experience. The third chapter is the experience takes place at a venue.
Mhm.
The fourth chapter is the experience rises out of a game. The fifth chapter is the game consists of elements. The elements support a theme. The game begins with an idea.
Mm.
That's the book. So it's about all of the interactions that the protagonist has,
Mm.
everything around, and
Which
goes
is a big
through the
sign on.
journey
Yeah. Mm.
to sort of get to the end point. And I mean, while the chapters sound meta, the subtopics are extremely granular. It's about, like, what is, if you had to design a persona, like what's the way to design a persona? Because, and I think, especially as you think about like AI agent, like every question that a product manager asks is a new question. Like, for example, should you personify, one is selling AI employee, should you personify this AI employee? Meaning, like, should you name it? Like, there's
Mm.
Emma and Ada, and we are calling it Pi, and so on, right? Salesforce calling it Einstein, or whatever else, right? Should you personify it? Should it be a male or a female? Should or an inanimate name that can be,
Mm. Mm.
from that to what the user experience should be, to how you sell it, to each of these things ultimately is an experience, a game that you're designing, where actually the buyer, the user, the product manager are all like players in that game. But I'm finding and I think it's allegorical because of some of the things that you just said, right? I mean, you said, I agree with you. I think sellers find it difficult to sort of sell products like this. Buyers are going through a shift in their buying experience. Product managers are going through a shift in how they have to build these. User experience designers are going through a shift in what
Yeah.
they it should be, etc. So every player in this game actually is going through a shift, and I think as founders, orchestrating that experience of that shift is important. And so I'm finding the book fascinating.
I'm going to buy and read. One more thing to buy, and hopefully I'll read like not in the next 1 year, but like yeah. See, I want to close, but like I'm just being selfish here. Like when we last spoke, you talked about like how you put a bunch of like college kids in a room, and they came up with no experience or legacy in the industry, and you observed how they approach a problem, and what you learned from it. I'm going to steal 5 more minutes of yours and talk about it, because that was a very fascinating conversation.
uh, you know from sort of starting with experience and exposure and seniority, because you sort of naturally gravitate
Start from that, yeah.
um, you know but we didn't get what we needed. We sort of worked our way backwards, right back to sort of undergraduate colleges, essentially, right? So co-op program where for they basically do an internship with you for 6 months. Stanford doesn't, so it's mostly just get into a room, buy them lunch and coffee, and throw a bunch of problems and let's whiteboard together.
It's not even the TMS problem that you threw at them. It
So
was
we sort of broke it up a little bit. It was our problem, meaning in the logistics space, but we didn't sort of give the whole canvas. It was just saying, look, I mean, let's take freight procurement, for example, and break it down into component pieces and start working through what this look like. And the way they look at it is not as a procurement problem or it's a business process flow. And there are 15 steps, and these are the data items. There are these. Where does this is the data I need? So like, where is that data? Right? Is it in some kind of a structured data? For example, one of the things that we that was an unlock for us very early was that when we were thinking about whether or not we should do this order, was we said, look, I mean, all of this data is there, but it's sitting somewhere in SAP. How do I do this? Or sitting somewhere in some ERP. How do I do this, etc. One of them said, what are you crying about? I mean, in legal tech or in some of the other areas, people have things sitting in as unstructured databases, or worse, not even digitally available, sitting in
papers, yeah.
paper and printed sheets, and they have to first convert that into into a digital format, and then into structured databases, and then be able to sort of consume them to do this. You have something sitting in a database somewhere that's already digital, and it sounds like, because one of the problems that is there, oh, too many tools and very siloed. So actually, that's great. That means that there is, for each
Structured
of
data
those
everywhere.
individual use cases, there are multiple databases. Oftentimes, it's probably overlapping, which means it's more rounded data
Yeah.
that you can then build models on top of to sort of have higher context. And so it's great. So to shift that perspective from being something, siloed is a problem, too many tools is a problem, integrations is a problem, to saying, actually, between these two problems, I'd much rather take the integration problem because it's easier than having no data, digital data problem, because that's the grunt work involved there is much harder, and the opportunity cost is actually pretty high in the other problem.
Yeah. Well, this is a super good way of spending 2 hours on Sunday morning. Both of us didn't yawn in spite of being sleep deprived. I'm presuming we are transferring that energy to anyone who is listening to this.
I hope that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nathan.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, sir. Views for AI, it's the deal. Moative show, get behind the wheel. Tune in now, tech we spill. Stories and moats, we get the drill.